as we come to our act of remembrance in communion this morning, it's vital that we understand what we are doing. The communion service draws us back to remember the reality that lies at the heart of our faith, that Jesus died to pay the price for our sin to God as God's acceptable sacrifice. And we know that for sure because God raised him from the dead. Now, being reminded of this core reality helps us as individuals, as a fellowship, to keep on a firm foundation with Jesus. Now, so that we can remember the reality of what Jesus has done for us, we're going to look in more detail at what those realities are through our next few communion services as we look at Hebrews chapter 10. And this chapter in particular has its focus on the importance of Christ's sacrifice for us and how we should respond to it. The book of Hebrews in general is a very important book in the New Testament as it draws from the whole of the history of what God has done for us in the Bible in order to highlight the wonderful good news about Jesus. Now, for better or for worse, looking back at history is one way, for instance in this country, where we as a nation at the present time, in our own day, we understand why we've got to where we are. So in our own day, this is being seen as increasingly controversial. There's an argument being made that modern Britain has been made by the worst bits of our history, such as slavery, for instance, and this idea is being strongly and rightly contested. A balanced view of the bad and the good is really the best way to help us. Now, history is also important in Hebrews. It shows how God's people have reached a particular point in time, as it remembers the reality of what God has done for his people in the past. However, history in Hebrews is far more than this. It also shows the way in which God has met with the past in the present and fulfilled it through Jesus for all time. This is why it's so important for us to remember these things. Now, the first thing that communion should remind us of is that so that we can have a relationship with God, there are requirements to be met. And to understand what these are, the person who wrote Hebrews takes us back in history, in the history of God's good news, to show us some important truths. And we're going to see what they are as we read Hebrews chapter 10 and verses 1 to 4 together. So Hebrews chapter 10, and we're going to read verses 1 to 4. And the writer to the Hebrews says this: "The law is only a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. For this reason, it can never, by the same sacrifices repeated endlessly year after year, make perfect those who draw near to worship. If it could, would they not have stopped being offered? For the worshippers would have been cleansed once for all, and would no longer have felt guilty for their sins. But those sacrifices are an annual reminder of sins, because it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins." May God help us as we seek to understand his word. Well, all of the points that we're going to look at this morning have one important purpose, and that is to remind the first readers, who are mainly Jewish Christians, that the system of sacrifices that they'd grown up with was not sufficient to make them right with God forever. Now, we see this already in verse 1, because we read there, "The law is only a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. So what does the writer mean by that? Well, God's history of good news is what is known as progressive revelation. Progressive revelation. Now, what that means is that God has revealed more about himself as time has gone on, or time has progressed, from the beginning of all things. God has revealed more and more. And as God has revealed more about himself, there are key points in this history where God has come to his people and made promises or covenants with them. Now, often when we think about covenants, the first person to come to mind for many people is Abraham, and God's covenant promises to him of offspring from whom many descendants would come, and God's gift of a land for Abraham's descendants to live in. The next significant covenant promise comes when God gives the nation of Israel, that is of course Abraham's descendants, the law through Moses. Now, often when we think about God's law, we think about the Ten Commandments. But there's actually more to God's law than this. In the past, theologians divided God's law into three parts in order to help us understand it. Now, these parts of the law are moral, which is the Ten Commandments, the civil, which is all about how society should run, and the ceremonial, which is all about how God should be approached. And what God now promised his people was that if they kept his law in whole, they would know his blessing and prosperity. If they failed to keep it, they would know his curse and ultimately exile from the land that he had given to them. And that was God's real requirement of his people. But the writer to these Jewish Christians has made it clear that this law, God's law, is only a shadow. In other words, it is a foreshadowing, a signpost, if you like, for it is directing God's people to something that he will do, which is going to be far, far better. The law is not the ultimate reality that God intends. As we'll go on to see, the law does not allow for God's forgiveness to be complete. Instead, it's a shadow of God's great plan of salvation which he was working out. That salvation, complete and eternal, was where God was directing his people. Now, whilst all this is certainly true, there was a problem in the here and now for God's people. The problem was God's expectations of how they should keep his law. God says, keep my decrees and laws, for the man, or woman for that matter, who obeys them, will live by them. I am the Lord. You see, God required his people to keep his laws perfectly, so that he would be honoured through them. Not only this, but his blessing of his people with continued life depended on it. And as we're going to go on and see, this was not possible for God's people to do. But because God knows us as people, inside out, because he's our creator, so for Israel, his people, he had provided the ceremonial law as a way in which they could maintain their relationship with him, with requirements that they had to remember to keep. And God insisted on these things being carried out because of an important spiritual reality, which is the problem of our sin. Now, that reality leads us to a second important point that the writer of Hebrews is reminding us of, that sin is serious to God. Now, as we've seen, God's requirement of his people was that they should keep his law perfectly. But they couldn't do this. It was impossible. And this law breaking we know and we call sin. One of the greatest commandments in God's law is this: love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength. But both the history of Israel and our own experience of life shows us that in this case we fall at the first hurdle. We are all guilty of not being able to keep that commandment in the way that God wants us to. Our priority is to get what we want out of life and not to follow him, even if on the outside we look as though we keep his rules. But if we cannot keep that commandment, then there is no hope of us keeping any other commandments. Sin wrecks our relationship with God, as instead of having the relationship with him that he wants for us, we settle for living as his enemies. For Israel, even though they'd made the special covenant promises with God, sin meant that they could never keep them. But God gave them his solution so they could remain in a relationship with him. This solution was the ceremonial law, which enabled Israel to come before God, who is perfectly pure and holy. An important part of which was to confess their sin and seek his forgiveness. This was vital because Israel's sin would otherwise have derailed that relationship and brought God's judgment on them. The requirements of the ceremonial law were there to help Israel remember how holy God was and how serious their sin against him was. Now, the principal requirement, and there are many requirements of the law, but the principal one that the writer of the Hebrews is drawing our attention to here was to keep the Day of Atonement, where once a year Israel's high priest would make a sacrifice of a goat on behalf of the nation, the blood of which he would take into the Holy of Holies and sprinkle it onto the atonement cover of the Ark of the Covenant. And the priest at the same time would also present a second goat to God, and he would confess the wickedness of God's people over it as he laid his hands on the goat's head. And after he'd done that, the goat would be taken away into the wilderness, where it would be released into a solitary place. And that was a vital picture that God, through the atoning sacrifice, had completely removed the sin of his people from them. Now, as we've said, the events of the Day of Atonement are what the writer to the Hebrews picks up on in these verses of Hebrews 10. We are shown that the seriousness of sin meant that Israel needed to make those sacrifices that were repeated endlessly year after year, so that they could continue to draw close to God and to continue to enjoy their relationship with him. But the sacrifices had another effect, though. They served as an annual reminder of sin and our inability to be able to shake the burden and the guilt of those sins off our own shoulders. Now, this brings us to the next point to remember, that the sacrifice suspends sin's curse. The sacrifice suspends sin's curse. Now, as we've seen earlier, when God made the covenant of the law with his people, those who did not follow it were cursed by him to face his judgment and his punishment for their sin. What the writer to the Hebrews is now showing us is that the required sacrifices of the ceremonial law, particularly that of the Day of Atonement, suspended the effects of that curse. Now, the positive effects we've seen already, that past sin was forgiven, so that God's people could continue on in their relationship with him for another year. Now, this was a real blessing. And what we see in these verses from Hebrews 10, and those things that the writer wants to highlight for us, is that there are negative aspects as well. You see, up to this point, there has been no fulfilment of the law. Sin has not effectively been dealt with. A way in things like the Day of Atonement has been provided to deal with the realities of sin and its effects, only for a short period of time. As our writer puts it, those who participated in these sacrifices could never be made perfect through them. As we go on to see, he asks this important question. If it could, would they not have stopped being offered? For the worshippers would have been cleansed once for all, and would no longer have felt guilty for their sins. The judgment and punishment that Israel deserved for their sin had only been suspended through these sacrifices. That is why they were reminders of sin and the continued threat of its curse hanging over God's people. As we read, it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Something better was needed. Something that would please God by meeting his requirements. Something that would deal with the sin of his people once and for all, and that would last forever. The good news is that these sacrifices and the laws that they were part of, dating right from the earliest history of Israel, were a shadow of the good things that are coming. These things are a signpost to a spiritual reality that God was going to deal with the reality of sin's curse once and for all. Indeed, and it's what Hebrews is all about, God has acted in Jesus. As we saw earlier, God required that our sin is dealt with so that we can have a real relationship with him. Now, in the past, Israel had followed this ceremonial law. They'd made animal sacrifices so that the penalty for their serious sin against God was suspended. Now, for the kingdom of God, which encompasses those from all nations, a new way was required, which would deal with the seriousness of sin once and for all, to which the sacrifices God required of Israel in the Old Testament were this signpost. Now, this signpost has pointed us to the reality that we're remembering in communion, that Jesus is God's sure and certain salvation for anyone who believes in him. So what did Jesus do that provided us with this sure and certain salvation? The Apostle Paul explains this in terms that we've been thinking about this morning when he wrote a letter to the Christians in the city of Galatia. And in chapter 3 of that book, he explains something of what we've already said, that those who obey the law will know God's saving blessings, whilst those who fail to keep it will live under his curse of judgment. Since no one can obey God's law perfectly, we are all under his curse. Instead, we can know God's salvation, the new life he wants to give us, as we trust in him to provide the way of salvation for us. And then Paul goes on to say this about Jesus. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hung on a tree. God required that a price was paid for the sins that we had committed. Jesus, who obeyed God his Father perfectly from his heart and with his life, willingly gave up his life, shedding his blood on the cross, so that he could become the curse for us, and through his sacrifice fulfilled the law's demand. That is, he met God's requirements as he paid the price for our sin in full. And what that means is the wonderful truth that anyone and everyone who acts in faith by trusting that Jesus died for them can know God's full and free salvation for themselves. It means a restored relationship with God and a life that's willingly taken in new directions, so that our desire is now always to put God first. Now, if you've never put your trust in Jesus, then now is the time to do so that you can know the blessing of God's salvation for yourself now and forever. The curse of sin will be removed as you trust in him, and he will personally lead your life and walk with you through hard times and good until you reach the place that he's prepared for you in heaven. For Christians, communion should help us to remember the seriousness of our sin before God. It should remind us of the importance of not keeping on sinning if we are those whose lives God has saved and transformed, and who have been given a new relationship with him through Jesus. We can often be guilty of treating sin as though it's something trivial, as though God sort of turns a blind eye to it. But we shouldn't be fooled. Sin is serious to God, and we will be held accountable for it. But as his people, why would we want to go on sinning and offending him? We should take sin seriously, and with God's help seek to deal with it in our own hearts and lives. Communion should also remind us that God's requirement for us to keep his law perfectly has been fully met by Jesus, so that we may know God's salvation through him. Sin makes us powerless to obey God, but Jesus has done everything for us so that our sin can be forgiven and we can know new life in him. Our sure and certain salvation relies entirely on Jesus and not at all on us, and that is wonderful news. But so often we forget, as we seek to go through life with Jesus, that his is the saving power that is at work within us. So often Christians can fall into the trap of saying, I must do things for Jesus, and treating them as though they were the way we are saved. They are not. And that's something that we have to take a very great care to avoid, as our works cannot offer any additional guarantee of salvation. Indeed, instead, they should be the fruit of our Christian lives, as we reveal Jesus at work in them, as we live them out. His is the saving power that we should only be drawing from to live life to please God and to his glory. Well, as we come to communion then, may we thank God as we are reminded that Jesus has met God's requirements so that our sin has been paid for in full and we can know his secure salvation. May we also take care to respond to what he has done for us in our hearts and with our lives as we reveal the living Lord Jesus to those around us.